Hi, today I'm going to be summarizing the book chapter 6 of Radical Behaviorism for ABA Practitioners by James N. Johnston. Chapter 6 starts off with a situation explaining a boy with autism who does not have much verbal behavior and he engages in tantrums. His BCBA conducted assessments and made a behavior plan which included the involvement of the BCABA as well as his parents. After some time, they saw a lot of progress and he was able to communicate with others on a much deeper level. His BCBA was now interested in how she could teach him how to solve problems and reason. The situation ends with the quote, "What exactly do you teach someone if you want to improve their ability to reason about events and circumstances in their lives and figure out how to solve problems, both large and small?" So this chapter is called What is Reasoning? And I'll be going through each section, giving a summary of it all. Section 1 is called More Than Verbal Behavior. Reasoning is a word to describe the human behavior of thinking things out or drawing conclusions. It's not actually a physical thing, but it's a verbal response. Even though the word reasoning doesn't elicit a physical meaning, it's the most powerful aspect of the human intellect. Johnston then poses the question, should reasoning be defined in its own special class of verbal behavior, or are we only looking for more of an explanation because the word reasoning demands explanation? Section 2 is titled The Proposition. A proposition is anything we know, believe, think, judge, or assume. A verbal behavior or a verbal statement of something we know is called a tact. Tacts are reinforced with the presence of an object, event, or the property of that object or event. An example of a tact would be saying apple if the response is reinforced with the presence of the apple. When I worked with pre-K and kindergarten, we usually conducted our tacting sessions when the child was playing with preferred items or during snack time. The student, for example, would say cookie, and they would be reinforced by the presence of the cookie as well as eating the cookie. A pure tact is when there is a sole source of control over the response. An abstract tact is when some property of the object or event control the event, like its color or shape. For example, red, a red apple. Any object can elicit different verbal responses. A proposition takes a tact another step further by connecting different forms of tacts with additional verbal responses. Using the word is, referred to as an assertive autoclitic, means declaring a position and expecting the learner to agree with you. An example of this is to say, an apple is red. It's making a relationship between the pure and abstract tact. The relationship between a pure and abstract tact make for a proposition. Verbal behavior that is in response to another verbal behavior is called an interverbal. An example of an interverbal would be asking a question and receiving a response. So if you ask, "What is that?" when shown a picture of an apple, the response would be apple. Quantifying autoclitics modify the reaction of the listener to the proposition. An example, the apple, an apple, some apples, and saying that all apples have cores is encouraging the listener to agree that not only some apples have cores, but all apples. Propositions involve the speaker's behavior, and there are consequences for both the speaker and the listener. Effective verbal behavior elicits reinforcing outcomes for the listener. Ineffective verbal behavior reduces the likelihood of reinforcement. When a listener accepts or believes the speaker's verbal behavior, then it is reinforcing to the speaker. Effective verbal behavior of the speaker is found when 1. The listener accepts or believes the speaker, or 2. The listener acts on what the speaker says and it produces reinforcement for them. Section 3 is called Premises and Conclusions. A speaker can be reinforced by the outcome of the listeners accepting their proposition. So as speakers, we have learned to improve the chances of a listener to accept our propositions by presenting them in certain ways and presenting first the propositions that are more readily accepted. A premise is a more believable proposition, and a conclusion is a proposition with enhanced acceptability. An example that Johnson gives in the book is the example of a prosecutor who is trying to get the jury to agree with their position that someone is guilty of a crime. As a speaker, they want to make sure that they are convincing and believable, and ultimately, they want to increase the chances that the jury will accept their position. They are going to present the evidence to make them credible. If the jury accepts the evidence, then they could convict the defendant as guilty. Reasoning with others involves verbal behavior that alters the chances of the listener to accept the proposition. Section 4 is labeled Logicality and Rules. Tacting can be of single events or objects, but it can also involve the patterning of multiple events together. Tacting of behavioral patterns or regularities can often be called rules. The rules of grammar are a basis of the regularities in verbal behavior. Following rules does not mean that rules govern our behavior, but our behavior is definitely controlled by the history of the consequences it produced in the past. Section 5 is called Deductive Reasoning, and the rules of deductive inference are one of the most common rules of logic. They refer to rules for arranging premises when there is a high likelihood that the listener is going to accept the multiple propositions. So, examples of the rules of deduction inferences are conjunctions, disjunctions, and implications. Conjunctions relate two separate propositions, and most oftenly the word is and, so if a listener accepts the two propositions separately, they are also likely to accept the conjunction. Disjunctions relate to propositions. Most oftenly, the word is or. So, an example of this, you can hear someone on the loudspeaker that is saying, the car in the parking lot, there's a car in the parking lot who left their lights on. And you hear someone say, either the car is white or it is not my car. Implications connect two propositions. Most oftenly, it's an if-then statement. Example, if the bell rings at 3 p.m., then school is over. And then section 6 is called inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning defers to the ways of arranging premises that do not conform to the rules of deductive reasoning. So essentially, it's the opposite of deductive reasoning. If an event occurs only when another event occurs, and never in its absence, it can be said that the two events are related. An example of inductive reasoning would be if you left for work at 8 a.m., you arrived to work on time. You would then assume that if you leave for work every day at 8 a.m., you will always arrive to work on time. Being deductively fallacious means you are relating one premise to mean the result of another premise without being certain that one caused the other. An example of being deductively fallacious would be saying that you got sick because another person that you sit next to in class was sick. There could be other factors, though, that led you to become sick other than the fact that the person sitting next to you was also sick. So that's basically the main ideas in Chapter 6. I want to open up a question for discussion. How have you used your own verbal behavior in ways to make the listener believe what you were saying? Did you notice that you were using a tactic of presenting the more easily accepted propositions before the more challenging ones? I'm excited to hear you guys' answers.